In this next section, I'm going to help walk you through the impacts of HIV/AIDS on several different institutions. We're going to start out by looking at the effects on assets. What I mean by assets are things that are collective assets for a community or a nation. So when we look at the impacts of HIV/AIDS, not only does it affect the individual, but it also affects larger society as a whole. When we look at an individual having this disease, their livelihood, of course, is going to be jeopardized. And it also is going to place their family in a place of vulnerability, both to disease, but also when we talked about food security, it's going to place them in a vulnerable place in terms of their ability to access food. Assets, institutions, and livelihood strategies all kind of fall under this category of things that are affected by HIV/AIDS. When we look at human capital, this is the idea that a society has an X number of people in their population and that those people contribute to the society. And so when you look at HIV and its effects on an individual, that also affects a nation's access to human capital, because if your population is suffering and dying from a disease, they aren't contributing to the society. When we look at HIV in a household and just at one unit, the productivity of that household is affected negatively by the disease. Someone with HIV/AIDS, if they have access to proper medication, may go through seasons of lack of productivity, but if they don't have access to medication, they can have prolonged periods and then ultimately resulting in their death from this disease. And so the household that individual lives in not only has the burden of this lack of income or lack of productivity of this individual, but they also have the added burden of having to care for the individual. So for example, if there are two adults in the household and one is sick with the disease, it's going to be the burden of the other individual or the other adult to take care of the sick person, but then also figure out how to double team and also provide an income stream. And when you look at people living in extreme poverty situations, this is a catch-22, and they can't necessarily navigate both things at the same time. Infected individuals eventually will die, but the problem with HIV is that these people are dying within their productive years. So people are dying in their mid-20s to mid-30s, which is generally an individual's most productive years, especially if you look at a country whose lifespan is 45 to 50 years. Those are key years in there, and that's when people are becoming sick with this disease. Productivity is further diminished as healthy individuals care for the sick. As I mentioned before, you have this burden placed on the individual in a household to care for the person that's ill, but then they also, when you look at how funerals happen in other cultures, a lot of times it's a very large community event, and everyone is participatory, and it takes several days. I was actually in Zimbabwe working with a furniture company a few years ago, and the owner of the company said that just in productivity losses for her company due to funeral attendance each month had dramatically impacted the ability of her workers to participate, because as the factory owner, she couldn't impose her. She didn't want to interfere with the social structures of attending a funeral because they're very important in that culture, but she also had to bear the burden of decreased productivity because people were taking so much time off of work to attend the funerals. When we look at human capital, children are often forced to leave school early if their parent suffers and dies from this disease, so that they can begin working and create a revenue stream. And so not only are they put in an orphaned or abandoned situation, but they're also, because they have to leave school, they have a lower level of education, and so that further decreases their ability to achieve higher work status. With this mid-generation dying, There's also less sharing of indigenous knowledge between the generations because as adults are passing away during their productive years, they're not able to pass on their knowledge and their social and structural institutions to their children. So we're not only losing these people, which is very tragic, but we're also losing the knowledge that they would have shared with the generations behind them, which is another tragedy in and of itself. When we look at the finances, of course, you have to account for the medical costs and also the funeral costs, which in countries where a funeral might go 3 or 4 days, you can imagine that becomes a very strong major financial burden for the families, but also for the communities, as I mentioned with the furniture factory. Because of the amount and frequency of the funerals, the workers were not able to produce as many pieces of furniture, as many goods during a set period of time. There's also the inability for a household to have as much household income, so the financial capital of the individual unit is affected. If a male breadwinner passes away or is sick, then the family has less access to capital. You also have households that are often forced to sell their assets. As Professor Coots mentioned earlier in this unit, you have households who, if there's a season where the individual that's affected is particularly ill, they might sell a goat, or they might sell furniture, or they might rent out a portion or a part of their home or their hut to earn the money to either buy food or to buy the medication to treat the disease. When we look at within the households, there's also a lot of difficulty in getting loans from banks because there's a lot of informal lending that takes place. Although there is a growing movement in microfinance, there's also a lot of people that are taking advantage of the ultra poor, and if someone is in a desperate situation, they'll offer them very high interest rates that the individual gets into a situation where they can't ever pay off the capital of the loan because they're always paying the interest. You see very similar things happen here in the United States. There are some organizations that will give people in great need a really fast loan, but it will be at an interest rate that the individual can't bear. And so again, it's this play between meeting a short-term goal or a short-term need versus thinking more long-term and more sustainable action. And people that are in a desperate situation, it's kind of the idea that you're going to put out the fire that's in front of you, and not necessarily worry so much about the whole farm or the whole house, but if there's a fire, you're going to put it out. And so people that are living day to day or hand to mouth are in very desperate and destitute situations. And so to get someone in that situation to think more long term, it's a very difficult task to achieve. When we talk about the early stages of this epidemic, it's important to note that an affected family is less able, when they get into these emergency loan type situations, they're less able to avoid defaulting, and then they're also more susceptible to get into an industry that has very questionable practices. For example, someone who has been put in this situation and has to take out an emergency loan or has to get quick access to capital could potentially get themselves into a place where they're into a forced servitude or indentured slave situation because there's no way that they can ever get out from under this debt, and they also, because they're in such a vulnerable situation, they're less able to avoid defaulting on this loan. So there are hundreds of thousands of cases worldwide where people are in this modern-day slavery situation, and there are organizations like the International Justice Mission who work to identify these individuals and then also rescue them from this situation. Families in this situation also get into a place where they might migrate to an urban center, so they might have a promise of a job in a restaurant or as a waitress or a nanny or something like that. And so they might send some of their young girls to the city to perform these domestic roles, but when the girls arrive in the cities, such as Bangkok, Thailand, for example, it's a big hub, they are actually being put in traffic situations and are sold into prostitution. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities that families in this situation have that are not only tied to money, but also move beyond money, where they get into a modern day slavery situation or a trafficked situation. When we look at natural and physical capital, that's where we go back and talk about the land. Oftentimes when you're living in the developing world, your land is your lifeblood. It's how you grow your food. It's how you pay for your family. Your family might have had this land for hundreds of years, so it's a very much tied to not only your access to capital, but also your identity. And when you think about how HIV/AIDS and this pandemic has affected access to land, generally people will sell their land in order to pay for the medical and funeral expenses. Land is also something that will children inherit, and so when a parent is forced to sell their land, that's something that their children cannot inherit. And when you look at women in societies that are patriarchal, if their husband dies of this disease, a lot of times the women don't have rights to the land, and so you get into a situation where if a father dies or the male figure dies in a family, because of the way the laws and customs are set up in a culture, the woman of that family not only loses her breadwinner and her husband or her son, she also loses her right to the land. So it's really a big snowball effect where one person gets affected by this disease and then it snowballs and affects the entire family and ultimately the entire community. And what happens is essentially families that are surviving don't have rights to the land, and so it gets absorbed or moved to a different family member or a different household. When we look at households looking to adopt less labor-intensive ways to farm, you get into a situation where they're forced to sell productive assets, things like livestock, and by removing land from a family, you're removing their ability to grow their own food. So again, it's a snowball effect where they're people that are vulnerable are becoming more vulnerable because of the prolonged effects of this disease. You also have a lot of issues with access to water and energy sources, things such as wood or access to streams and rivers. And when a woman is sick or has to spend more of her time caring for those that have the disease, it often leaves the responsibility to children to collect water and wood. And if you remember from the video I showed in Unit 2 about women in Uganda collecting wood for cooking, traveling to and from their village to the place where they can get the wood, oftentimes they're susceptible to violence, they're susceptible to rape. So if you think about how vulnerable a grown woman is, just imagine how much more vulnerable a young child is to all of those problems and more. So it's really a compound effect and a snowball effect on the impacts of a family, but then also the much larger impacts on a community. Essentially, this disease undermines the ability of a community to pull together and work to maintain the common properties, maintain the croplands, maintain the river basins, because each individual contributes to that ability, and as you begin removing individuals from that situation, it has this overall negative effect on the community. So in thinking about not only the community's access to natural capital, I want to shift focus and focus a little bit on social capital, because if you look at a lot of communities in the developing world, these are communities and people and individuals that have very strong ties to their social identity, as well as very strong ties to their region of origin. And so if you begin degrading the ability of that community to rely on their land or their village, as well as begin removing individuals through death from this disease, you're really drastically affecting the ability of a community to maintain itself. And so they might, as I mentioned before, begin sending either young girls or their children or their brothers and sisters to urban centers to try to earn incomes there and send it back. But by sending those individuals to the cities, they're degrading the social structure of the community, but they're also those individuals are becoming isolated in the urban centers, and they're drawn away from this community that they've grown up in and get their identity from, and that it puts both people and both individuals in very vulnerable situations. When we think about social capital, this is essentially the ability of people to contribute to the society as a whole, and because people are HIV/AIDS has, especially historically, there's been a lot of campaigns to lessen the stigma of this disease, but even here in the United States, there's still people who hold very strong stigmas against those who are infected with this disease. But because there's such a stigma attached to the disease, people don't talk about it, it's not addressed. If someone's suspected of having the disease, that family or that individual might be ostracized from the community. And so not only are they sick and not able to contribute, they're also in a more vulnerable place because they are being ostracized. When we think about institutions that contribute to social capital, this is things like non-governmental organizations, which we call NGOs, or faith-based groups. These are likely to weaken also as members become sick with this disease and die. An example that's coming to the top of my head, I was in Zambia in a remote bush village, and I was working with a doctor, an American doctor who is in this village. It was about 17,000 people, and she had a compound. It was the only place in the whole village where there was electricity and running water, and she was trying to train a doctor in the village, from the village, to work with her so that she could eventually, go back to America and work there. But she was trying to train people within the community to deal with the disease and also deal with just the basic injuries of life. And one of the problems she was facing is that as people were becoming sick with the disease, even though she had trained them and they knew what HIV was, they knew that they had it, they knew what appropriate treatments were, she was finding that the more sick people got, the more they would turn away from Western medicine and more towards voodoo treatments and voodoo doctors. And there was a great problem with that, because not only were the people moving away from taking the antiretroviral treatments, they were then becoming susceptible to these debts that we were talking about, with having to pay the voodoo doctors a certain amount of money, or they would have to leave the village and participate in rituals away from the village. But the problem is that they were still getting sick and dying anyway. And so there was this great tug and pull between her work and trying to train people, and then as people were getting sick and dying, not really contributing to the work that was being done that might actually build a social structure that could deal with the disease. But people were becoming scared and going back to things that weren't helping really at all. So HIV definitely has a strong impact on the ability of a community to care for itself, but then also the individuals and individual members to contribute to the society.